The most important thing with the principles that I am putting forward is that the first thing you must look at are the pawns. The pawn is the most important thing in the lessons. And you will notice that I'll constantly go back to the pawns. There's a reason for this. You see, the pawn is the only piece in chess that, number one, cannot move backwards, and number two, does not take as it moves. I mean, if you look at, say, the knight, well, the knight captures as it moves, right? Goes like that. The bishop, the same thing. Bishop captures as it moves. The queen captures as it moves. The king, the same. Let's put the pawn over there for an example. The king also captures as it moves. So all the pieces capture as they move except the pawn. The pawn is the only piece that captures differently from how it moves. So what does this mean? It means that if we set a pawn in a certain formation, once you play this move for an example, and the opponent plays that, well, this is out of your hands. You can no longer alter this position. So we need our opponent to cooperate. We need our opponent to give us something to exchange, or our opponent to exchange that pawn themselves. So this means that obviously some of the structures that are there, they're not necessarily permanent, but they will be there for at least the next 10 to 15 moves. Then the next important thing is to understand, let's talk about the definition of the pawns themselves and squares. You see, the most important pawn that attracts us when we are looking at the position and formulating a plan is what we call a weak pawn. This is very important because a weak pawn is a liability. It means that the opponent, or if you have a weak pawn, you indeed need a number of pieces to constantly guard this pawn, because as we all know, if you are down material, it becomes a problem. So if you lose that pawn, you're a pawn down, and you probably will not be able to get back. So any pawn that can be protected by another pawn, say for example, that pawn there as an example, is a weak pawn. It's a liability, because what does it mean? It means that we need a bigger piece to protect the pawn. Other pawns that interest us, for example, are doubled pawns, say there, especially if they are isolated and also cannot be protected. They are also a weakness that we will try to take advantage of. But if, for example, a pawn was over there, we could just move the pawn forward and the pawn would be able to protect the other pawn. There also is the issue of the pawn going into the opponent's territory. There is a certain change in the position once the pawn goes into the opponent's territory. The first rank to the fourth rank is white territory. Then from the fifth rank to the eighth rank is black's territory. So should a pawn move over to the fifth rank, there are certain changes that will happen in the position. And now let us go into this quick formula that I have formulated. You see, once we have established the pawns, we then look at the influence that these pawns have on these three pieces, which is the rook, the knight, and the bishop. And that's how we look at the position. We look at the influence of the pawns on the structure, on the rook, the knight, and the bishop. Let's talk about this influence further. Once the pawn is not there, say in this position the g pawn was not there, there's an influence that this has on the rook. So we see the rook increases in strength because there is no pawn there. This is what we might call an open file. At this stage, we'll call it a half open file, because for black still has a pawn over there. Say that pawn wasn't there, this is now an open file. And black would also contest this open file by maybe playing rook c8 at a certain stage. The next influence we'll have is the influence that the pawns have on the knight. This is what we call an outpost. Normally, if the opponent, an outpost is anywhere on the fourth rank, if you're playing white. If you're playing black, it would be a square anywhere on the fifth rank. And it's important for the knight to still be on your territory, because you can protect it. And from there, it is able to attack into the opponent's territory. For an example, if you were to think to yourself, how do you know that you could create an outpost? That is, if the opponent pushes a pawn into your own territory. Say, for example, we're playing and the opponent plays the move d4. This is a signal that there is a possibility for me to create an outpost. And I could create this outpost over there on c4 or over there on e4. But e4 is pretty difficult because it's very central. So c4 would probably be easier. So I want my knight to go over there. But then the problem is that this pawn could kick the knight, b5. So first I will play the move a4 for an example. Then I will maneuver my knight to go over to c4. This knight on c4 will have some influence into the opponent's territory, and still the pieces around the knight are able to protect this knight. The next influence that we're always going to talk about is the bishops. We'll always talk about good and bad bishops. Now, how we find good and bad bishops is what we call static pawns. Once pawns are static, it means that they are not in a position to move. And say there's a pawn on c4 and another one on c5. They could also be on d4, d5, or e4, or e5. These pawns have an influence on the bishops. For an example, white squared bishop is now worse than white's black squared bishop, because this bishop is always blocked in by its pawn on c4. Notice that once the bishop is over here, if the bishop wanted to go over there, it will have to go all around this pawn. All right, like that. So this would be, it's still better than the knight, but it is a bad piece compared to the black squared bishop. For black, this is black's bad bishop, and this is black's good bishop. So what do both players want to do in such a situation? White would like to exchange their bad bishop for the opponent's good bishop, and black the same. They would like to exchange their bad bishop for the opponent's good bishop. So that would be the battle in terms of good bishop versus bad bishop. The pawn also influences squares, obviously. If a certain square cannot be protected by a pawn, let's say you play the moves in the beginning, f4 followed by d4. It means that e4 is a weak square because it cannot be protected by any pawn from the f or from the d. So the opponent would play a move like d5 or f5, which is what we call fixing the weak square. Now, these very simple principles we will be able to apply in our own games. But before we do that, look at the lessons that I'm offering you, and you will notice that they are very, very easily applicable. We will look at normally the theory in terms of a game that was played between very strong players. Then in many other lessons, I'll show you some of my games where I was able to apply those principles that were used in those games. I hope you will enjoy the lessons, and I hope we'll travel together on a journey where you can then become a better strategist.